fighting chance.
Follow your nose.
See what Mom's baking up.
Follow your nose.
A homemade taste is baking up.
I'm baking Duncan Hines cookies. The homemade taste comes from the best ingredients, good as scratch. And this Duncan Hines flavor packet, it's so easy.
May I lick the spoon?
Follow your nose.
Duncan Hines is baking up.
I smell cookie. Chocolate.
They love my Duncan Hines cookies.
A real homemade taste.
Just follow your nose.
Up. Gotta get up. Up. Oh, which way?
Mark Palmer needs Coast deodorant soap. Its exhilarating scent makes it the eye-opener. Handfuls of bubbly lather make you feel more than clean. It actually brings you back to life.
Well, that's great soap you bought. What's its name? Maybe some people can't wake up as easily as me.
Bring yourself back to life. Coast deodorant soap, the eye-opener.
Busy?
Lunch for the kids. Join us?
Good old salmon sandwiches? No, let me guess. Tuna?
Guess again.
Flakes of chicken? New?
New from Maple Leaf. Tender white chicken for tasty sandwiches, ideal in salads. Anywhere you'd use salmon or tuna. A delicious change of taste.
Nice change.
Tastes terrific. Let me guess. Flakes of chicken?
A delicious change of taste from salmon or tuna. Tender white chicken. New Maple Leaf flakes of chicken.
Webster is next on BCTV.
Good morning. We have no instant disputes to solve this morning, so class will come to order. And the teacher today will be a political scientist turned bureaucrat turned Liberal cabinet minister, which means he's a fat cat from Ontario, of course. His name is John Roberts, and he is the Minister of Environment. He's the acid rain expert, and also something called science and technology. And to add a little bit of political jab to the program will be that peripatetic Bulloch, the guy who's the big tough spokesman for the Canadian Federation of Independent Businessmen who are panic-stricken about the new tough tax measures to be brought down by that sparkling finance minister from somewhere in the east called Alan What's his name again?
McKechnie, I think is the word you're looking for.
McKechnie, that's right. But first, John Robertson, who's going to tell us how we're being deluged with acid rain, fish being killed after the break. Highly unfair introduction to a very nice fellow from some constituency in Toronto where they have it made. You know, they should worry about the rest of the country. Good morning, Mr. Roberts.
Good morning, Jack.
So nice to meet you.
It's good to be here.
You want to talk about the Constitution?
Whatever you want to talk about.
Do you want to talk about the Constitution?
Well, why not talk about the Constitution? It's a pretty important event.
But why waste our time? You've got the majority. You're going to bring it back your way, unilaterally, with the amendments made by the Mother of Parliaments, and slap it on our doorsteps.
Well, we want to bring it back with the support of all the members of Parliament. We want the people of Canada to understand what we're doing. It's not just a question of pushing it through the House of Commons. We'd like to people understand why we think it's important and what it's going to do.
Are you suggesting to me that Trudeau's mind is not made up and that he will not push it through the House of Commons?
Well, I think it's going to go through the House of Commons. I think it's going to be supported not just by Liberals. I think it's going to be supported by members of other political parties as well.
The thing that sticks in my craw as a Canadian, 33 years a Canadian, is that the amendments will be made by these British in London.
Well, that's the situation we're trying to get out of. We want to go one last time to make sure that we are not the only independent country in the world that has to go to some other country to get changes to its fundamental constitution. That's the situation we're in now.
Forget the expression and the Anglo-Saxon attitude, but wouldn't it have been more like cricket, just to bring it back and then do your own changes here? You still have the majority. You can do what you like.
Well, when we bring it back, we're bringing it back with a very complicated, a very difficult amending formula. And we think liberals, in any case, think, and I think it'll be supported by others, that there's a need as well in this country for a charter of rights which protects individual citizens against the federal government and against provincial governments. And if that's going to happen, it's going to happen now. It's not going to happen as a result of going through that amending process 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
I hate this idea of a U.S.-type constitution. Don't
Well,
you?
we have a U.S.-type constitution in that we have a federation. That's the only aspect of a United States-type constitution that we have in this country. We have British parliamentary procedures in both our legislatures and the House of Commons. We have a federation because of the size of the country, because of the regional interests in the country. I don't know of any other federation in the world that doesn't have a Charter of Rights that protects individuals.
I suppose I reflect the kind of my age group, and I've been around politics a long while, and I'm highly cynical of federal and provincial governments, and I know that judges are wonderful, but I know that they're politically appointed, still are, and we might finish up with the U.S.-type packed Supreme Court. I would rather trust you, John, than a collection of judges patently gathered by a domineering government over the years.
Well, that's flattering. Thank you very much.
Well, it's not that flattering. Don't misunderstand me. I mean, I'm not
You only
that
trust
flattering.
me a little bit.
I can throw you out every 4 years.
Yeah.
I can dump you.
Yeah.
I don't have to wait till you're 75.
But what do you have in legislatures? What you generally have is a majority, right? It's dominated by a majority. And the people who really need to have their rights protected are not majorities, they're minorities. I mean, do you really trust the Liberal majority and Trudeau and the Parliament?
Oh, certainly
Do you
not.
trust Bill Bennett and the
Oh,
Social
certainly
Party?
not.
And I think most people would agree with you. They want their fundamental rights protected not by politicians who sit on majorities. I think they'd prefer to have them protected by courts who will protect individuals and minorities. I don't say it's a fail-safe mechanism. I just say it's better than the system we have now. You talked about the
Well,
United
it
States.
doesn't really matter what we think anyway, because you're going to bring it through.
I
With or without the
no, I think
NDP support, you can pass the Constitution.
I hope we will have the support of the NDP. I even hope we'll have the support of some of the Conservative members.
Don't you think it would be a good idea if you and the NDP just really got right into bed together so that we could take the right-wing Liberals off your back and put them all in with the Tories and have a nice, clean two-party system?
Well, I'd love to have a two-party system, and I'm happy to have the support of the NDP on anything that we want to get done. I'm happy to have the support of Conservatives.
But when we see the budget, whenever it is next Tuesday, it's going to be Clark's budget anyway, more or less.
Clark's budget? No, it's not going to be Clark's budget.
Well, look at the way the
It's gonna
price of gas has gone up.
It's going to be a budget that will be presented by McKechnie. You'll have to wait and see what's in it, but I don't think when you look at it, you'll say that's the budget that the Clark government or that Crosby would have brought down.
Tough budget. Like
Well,
they,
maybe.
in their naivety, wanted to bring in, and you people said, oh, we wouldn't do that.
Maybe.
Not much you
It
wouldn't.
may be a tough budget, but the allocation of the toughness and where the burden falls is something that may be rather different.
You're a minister of, what is it again?
Minister of the Environment, Minister of State for Science and Technology, two departments.
I said former bureaucrat. What were you as a bureaucrat?
Oh, in the early 1960s, I was a member of the Department of External Affairs, and then I became an official in the Office of the Minister in Forestry and Rural Development, it was called then. Ultimately developed into the Department of Regional Economic Expansion.
And you decided that the way to clean up the bureaucracy was to become a parliament and hire more, become an MP and hire more of them.
No, I decided to go into politics because there were things that I wanted to get done, and I thought that politics was the place to do them.
Let's see how good a bureaucrat you still are. How big is your Department of Environment? What's the budget?
Oh, we're into a couple $100 million, I would think.
No, don't give me a couple of $100 million. It's my money you're spending. Is it 100, 200, or 300?
Somewhere around 200 million.
200 million, okay. More or less than 200 million?
We'd have to see.
Or don't you know?
No, because I don't need to know that kind of detail about the department. I do when I'm preparing for this.
How many civil servants? Give or take 1,000.
Give or take 1,000. I don't know, 20,000 maybe.
In the Department of Environment?
Yeah, we do a lot of research. We have Environmental Protection Services, the Atmospheric Environment Services, the Federal Environment Assessment Review Organization, the Ministry of the Department, the Forestry responsibilities of the federal government. There are a whole variety. Canadian Wildlife Service.
Isn't that one of the things about this country that really, what's a nice way to put it, annoys one? Provincial environment, provincial forestry, federal environment, federal forestry. Do you need these savages at all?
Well, what's the alternative, Jack? Are you suggesting we should just have a unitary government without provincial and federal responsibilities? You know, the basis of this country has been the belief that that the diversity is such that you have to have two levels of government. To deal with national programs, national issues, and then recognize that there are regional and local interests which can be met better by a regional government. As long as you're going to have that, you're going to have some overlap of functions and some fudging at the edge.
An awful lot of overlapping, an awful lot
I would prefer to have a rather clear
Look at the Cape
distribution of
of
powers.
Kitsalt.
We've been trying to get that for For the last 12 years anyway, in the constitutional discussions we've been having with the provinces, we've been trying to clarify responsibilities, exchange powers. The provinces have been asking for some things that they want to have, powers they want to have, and we've been asking for some things we want to have.
One of the things that,
to clear that up, I think you're right about that.
Strikes the ordinary person is we had all this foo-fa-ra about all the first ministers meeting for months and years and months and years. When it finally chops off, we find out that Pierre has said anyway, we'll do it my way.
No, you remember that leaked memorandum, the one with the Machiavelli quote? And
Yes.
And everybody picked out of it all of the scenarios which we described as options if the conference failed. But what people didn't pick out is what is said again and again and clearly in it, that we would prefer to come to an accommodation. We would prefer to have a deal. Nobody said that.
Of course,
in that case, we would have preferred
to be a little more sympathetic.
sympathetic.
There was no way that a deal could be made unanimously with the man who wants to smash the country sitting at the table. Isn't that right? Levesque?
But it wasn't just Levesque. You know, the other premiers, too, had forgotten that urgency that they had expressed in the spring about a thoroughgoing change to our Constitution. There they were bargaining for specific things they wanted, cable television,
But my question to you is, as long as Levesque is sitting there as head of that government, there is no way...
But Levesque, I think, was frightened of appearing to be the guy who torpedoed it. He needed to have the other provinces going along with resistance. He wouldn't. It was very difficult to stand out and be the only one. It would have hurt him very much in Quebec.
Yeah, but he was the guy who managed to slip into the preamble a free association of provinces.
Well, we didn't accept that.
Well, you haven't got a preamble at all to your rather dull
we certainly haven't put that in it. We don't have a preamble. Maybe we should. We don't have a preamble because we didn't want to create more controversy than we had. We brought forward the minimum that had to be done as far as we were concerned.
It's a typical Canadian compromise. We didn't dare have a preamble because it would have said something like, one nation indivisible.
Well, because...
Wouldn't it? Like the U.S. Constitution says.
We must have tried 6 or 7 different kinds of wordings to try and gain support for what...
John, let's forget that because you're going to pass the Constitution anyway.
I think we are because I think the people of Canada support it. And I think that we'll find that a very strong majority of members of Parliament support it, not simply Liberals.
Don't you think that the average man in the pub, my mythical taxi driver man in the pub, doesn't give a damn?
Well, I think that, it's wrong to say that people come down in the morning and say their wives, I couldn't sleep all night because I was so worried about the reform of the Constitution.
But they are worried in Ontario about acid rain because we'll have it here next, perhaps. We don't know what John Roberts will tell us, but we'll try him on it after the break. Quite seriously to John Roberts, the Minister of Environment, right at this very moment, or yesterday anyway, there was a cloud of atomic particles above North America. Chinese
nuclear explosion.
What reports do you have on it?
We've had a lot of reports. All of the indications so far is that there is no hazard, but the situation is being monitored by my department, Environment, also by Health and Welfare for human health hazards, and Agriculture to see if milk is picking up any radioactivity. All of the reports so far indicate no problems, but we're sufficiently concerned that we're going to keep on the monitoring, obviously.
You'll keep on the monitoring, but there's virtually nothing you can do about any further particles of strontium, whatever, in milk.
No, except that if that becomes a problem, you can warn people. You can take the milk, you can dispose of it, and so on. You have to know what's happening because people have to be protected. But you can't stop it from happening.
It must have been a fairly clean bomb then.
Jack, I don't know enough about nuclear warfare to say it. I gather the cloud is very high. It'll go around the world. It'll gradually disperse. Whether any kind of nuclear explosion is clean or not clean, that I don't know.
I suppose if one were going to be cynical, one knows better what's liable to affect one's health, because in my day as a child, people died of TB, diphtheria, and old people died of pneumonia.
Well, now with the improvement of scientific knowledge, we know a lot more about what's happening to us.
We know what kills us.
We know what kills us. We know what's killing our lakes, for instance.
A great and pressing problem in Ontario East is this acid rain.
That's right.
Now, is that another insuperable problem about which, in effect, when you look around the world, you can't do anything about?
No, it's not insuperable. We know what causes acid rain, and we know how to stop it, but it's costly to stop it.
What causes it?
What causes it is that in smelting or in thermal plants, whatever, if you put sulfur dioxide up into the air, it goes into the atmosphere, it reacts with rain, falls as a mild form of sulfuric acid. mild form of sulfuric acid, but when it collects in our forests or collects in our lakes, it kills. It's a rain of death.
How many hundreds of lakes have been killed in Ontario East?
Oh, well, we know well over a couple of hundred are killed, but what we're worried about is the Scandinavian example. The Scandinavians started worrying about it 10 years ago, and now over half of the lakes in southern Scandinavia have gone dead. They won't support life. And
aren't they supposed to be clean industrialists, the Scandinavians?
Well, the problem wasn't for the Scandinavians. The problem was with the Germans, the French, and the British, who were in the Ruhr and in their industrial processes were creating the sulfur dioxide, which drifted over Scandinavia. It wasn't produced in Scandinavia. They were the unwilling recipients of it, coming from other countries. And
so
that's our problem a bit too, because 2/3 of the acid rain problem in Canada flows into this country from the United States. We then export it back to them in the eastern seaboard.
Yeah, because you've had dreadful problems for years, only recognized the last 10 or 15 years with your pollution in the Great Lakes and the acid lake.
Well, and part of the problem we have now is because of the earlier attempts to respond to that pollution. If it's like Sudbury and Inco, we used to be devastated. And they said, well, what we need are higher smokestacks so that we don't devastate the region here. What they did was they threw the sulfur dioxide up into the air, carried long distances, fell as acid rain somewhere else.
But there's an economic balance sheet where anti-pollution devices become no longer, to use that horrible civil service word, viable.
Well, there is technology that will deal with the problem now. We're doing a lot of research to try and make that technology cheaper. But we estimate that between now and the end of the century, it's going to cost something like $400 million a year, not by government, but within our society, to respond to it. That's an awful lot of money. Now, and the United States will be 5 to 8 times that. But the cost of not responding is going to cost even more.
Does this sulfur dioxide come principally from coal?
A lot of it comes from coal, yeah.
Well, here we're rubbing our hands in Western Canada saying, well, we don't really care about the Arabs. We've got natural gas if the feds don't steal all the revenue. We've got oil in Alberta, and we've got billions of tons of coal. Would this not preclude the full development of that coal? Otherwise, we're going to ruin our lakes.
It doesn't preclude it, but you have to build in technologically what are called scrubbers or other technological devices to take the sulfur dioxide out of the coal as it's being used. That can be done. The big problem is with plants which already exist. It's the retrofit. It's going back and improving existing facilities. If you're talking about new activities, then it's possible to build in, it'll cost something, but it's possible to build in the pollution control devices.
Yeah, one worries about generations down the road, but for the moment we've got to survive, we've got to produce these things, so therefore we must accept a measure of pollution regardless.
Well, if you have a measure of pollution which, well, acid rain, just in terms of buildings in North America, the Americans estimate at the moment is costing between $2 and $4 billion in erosion in buildings. The Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor is being affected by acid rain. The impact on sport fishing in Canada will be great. The impact on our forest industry, we can't assess that very well, but if it means a 1%, if the effect of acid rain is a 1% decline in our forest productivity, that's an awful lot of money for Canada.
Gosh, you feel like saying, why bother? Now, for instance, I had the Nisga'a, spokesman for the Nisga'a Tribal Council on here the other day, protesting very bitterly about the lack of action or the confusion of action between the federal and provincial governments on the plans of a big mining company whose name unhappily escapes me.
But this is the Alice Arm, the
Kitsault, where they're going to dump, apparently, the tailings right on the seabed at the end of this large, beautiful lake. Now, can you step in with federal powers if you so decide? You've done some studies up there and say, stop.
The Department of Fisheries and Ocean has made, I think now, 2 studies on that in conjunction with the Department of the Environment. And to the absolute best of our scientific knowledge, there is no environmental problem attached to that development.
On the face of it, it would seem perfectly horrible to do, wouldn't it? To dump the tailings into the ocean.
Well, that depends if it has an impact upon fish and the other resources of the area, doesn't it?
I don't know. I shouldn't throw my hands up in horror and say we shouldn't do anything about it.
Well, we live in a complicated world. We're understanding it better as the base of our scientific knowledge improves, and we're going to have to, on the base of that scientific knowledge, develop techniques to minimize the risks and dangers to the exploitation of our environment.
Change of topics. What says I had that you're the man in the black hat who has most unfairly hammered the leaseholders in Banff, Jasper, and Waterton with a policy which increases their lease ground rents or whatever by up to 1,500%. Now, I'm not on either side of the fence. Were they paying too little before, or are you gouging them now?
No, I'm a guy with a white hat. Look, what happens is this. There are leases in the parks. There are 3 different kinds of leases. Those leases are reviewed every 10 years. And I did not change the assessment formula. The assessment formula is that they pay a rent of 6% of the value of their land, not the value of the building on it, 6% of the value of the land. That's always been the case. Every 10 years they're reassessed because the land values go up. The land values have gone up, and as a result, in many cases, the rents have gone up. I, in fact, am triggering in the increases over a longer term so that the initial impact is not as great as it otherwise would be.
One more short segment with John Roberts, Minister of the Environment, after the break. As I was saying before we were interrupted, or as you were saying, give me the score on these leases. You say there are three categories of leases in all national parks.
Yeah, let me tackle this, because there are three kinds of leases. There are the cottage owners, right? There are people who have to reside in the parks because they work there, and then there are the commercial properties.
Right.
Now, what we've said in relation to people who have to live in the park because their job is there, they pay a nominal rent between $100 and $250. Now, that's surely not excessive.
Right, it's too cheap.
Well, maybe it is too cheap, but it's certainly not excessive. And they're the cottage owners.
And you own the cottages?
No, they put the cottages on. They hold the land a long-range lease. All right, and the value
$100-250 a month.
100 to 250 a year.
A year.
For people who have to, for people who must live in the park to work.
That's the ground rent.
That's the ground rent. Yeah, that's a nominal rent because they have to work there. Okay. Now, cottage owners. You know, the standard, for years and years and years, has been 6% of the value of the land, not the building, of the land.
Right.
And when the rents were reassessed because the property values have gone up, a lot of those rents have gone up. And we've offered to make arrangements for phasing it in over a longer period of time. We've offered to look at hardship cases. We don't want little old widows to be thrown out of their cottages and so on. And then the third category is the commercial lease.
The hotel.
The hotel, the shop, it sells tackle, fishing tackle, whatever. And we said 6%, we believe it's fair. If you'd rather move some to other basis, if you want to pay us as a percentage of gross, if you want to prepay, then we'll look at that. But why should the Canadian taxpayer subsidize the commercial operation in the park? Why should people not pay a fair economic rent on their commercial properties? Now, so let me say, so I didn't set the 6%. That's been established for a long, long time. And I didn't do the assessment of the properties. They were done by outside appraisers. And there's an appeal process which they can go to. They can go to arbitration. They can go to the courts if they want to try and assess if those land assessments have taken place fairly. I don't think anybody's going to say that 6% of the value of the ground is really an unfair rent.
Not for the CPR, anyway.
And if people don't feel that their property's been assessed fairly, then they can go either to arbitration or they can go to the courts.
I'm trying to make you look good. Did the rents go up 1,500% or not?
There may be some cases where the value of the property increased so much that the increase of the rent would have been that high.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. I don't think there's any basic complaint about that, but they did take action against you and get an injunction.
There was an injunction which has been lifted, and there are people who are going to court, as they have a perfect right to do, and the court will thrash it out. The last time, I think I'm right in saying this, the last time, 10 years ago, we went to court, the courts complained not because we had set the rents too high, but because they were too low. People in Ontario are paying 10%, not 6%.
What are they paying here?
6% of the ground.
Oh, now we're talking about Banff, Jasper,
Waterton. That's right, Waterton, yeah. Riding Mountain,
yeah. Remember there used to be a bit of a fiddle on the various yacht clubs around here. Are you involved in that?
No, in yacht clubs?
Waterfront properties?
No.
Used to pay next to nothing for the beautiful properties in Stanley Park and elsewhere, but that has been amended.
It's not involvement of environment, no, or parks.
Good about that, because they're probably still too cheap. I don't own a yacht, so I don't give a damn how much the government jabs them. You are in town for the British Columbia Economic Forecast and Constitutional Changes. What's this?
There's a luncheon today, and I'm participating in this day's session to try and explain our constitutional proposals to the people of British Columbia. I believe Premier Bennett is going to be there, and a variety of other officials are going to be presenting their views.
When I read the Constitution Act, I was a bit concerned about the wooliness of your sections on equalization payments, on which I am sure you will be tackled today. Why didn't you just put in a formula for that? Because it looks as if you could do whatever you like with federal money anywhere at any time. And it doesn't seem to refer to today's equalization formulas.
Well, because those formulas are basically administrative, they're negotiated every 5 years. What the provinces wanted, and what we thought was also a good idea, was to have the principle of equalization placed in the Constitution, and that's what's been done. How the application of that principle has to be worked out.
But obviously written by some Eastern lawyer, because it doesn't spell it out as a matter between provincial governments and federal governments.
I think, Jack, we accepted the wording that was proposed by British Columbia.
Quite one funny little quirk is that, as a fat cat from Ontario, you will have a smirk too. Ontario qualified last time around for equalization payments, but decided not to collect them.
Well, you talk about fat cats in Ontario, but the fact is that the manufacturing sector of the Canadian economy, as you know, is suffering severe pressure, and a large part of that manufacturing sector is in Ontario. I think the future of Ontario is bright, but it's not an area of the country that doesn't have economic problems. You know
I went in to look at a pair of shoes the other day, and I came out hating the Liberal government, remembering the business about the tariffs and the quotas to protect Eastern Canadian manufacturer. And for a pair of ordinary Scotch-type brogues, old-fashioned, guess how much?
How much?
Guess how much?
$60?
$125.
See, I have the same problem. I can go to Buffalo or New York City and buy shoes a lot more cheaply than I can buy them in Toronto.
But you got to spend the weekend there, so or smuggle them back across the border, and no federal cabinet minister would ever do that.
Certainly not.
Yeah, but that's your policy that makes these shoes $125 to protect Ontario and Quebec industry, is it not?
It's true, Jack, that we do believe strongly in the maintenance of a strong, free, and national economy. A free trade area, a common market across the northern half of North America.
But we suffer. I mean, sports clothing, kids' clothing, and Taiwanese stuff, which the Vancouver housewives used to be able to buy at a reasonable price to protect your jobs.
And we suffer, too, from that same effort.
But you get the jobs, at least.
Well, you're getting more and more jobs here. Is there a great deal of unemployment in British Columbia?
No, there is not. Right. In fact, many Western Canadians think that despite what happens in the Constitution or what happens in Victoria, the country is so healthy it will survive regardless.
Well, I think
do you feel that?
I think it can survive a lot better with the kind of constitutional proposals which we're bringing forward, because I think it'll end a lot of sterile debate about constitutional forms. I think the people of the country are a bit impatient with this. I think they want us to get it finished with and go on and do other things.
As a matter of fact, you are not doing your job as a government because you're all hog-tied in this constitution, federal, provincial.
Well, I think we're doing our job as a government. We're not just dealing with the Constitution. As you mentioned earlier, we're going to be bringing forward a budget. We have to bring forward our energy pricing policy. Other things are happening, but this is an important part of our responsibilities.
Natural gas tax?
You'll have to wait and see what Mr. McEachran says when he brings down his budget.
Then we'll have to wait and see what Bennett and Lougheed and Blakeney and company say.
We'll have an interesting year politically.
My thanks to John Roberts, Minister of Environment, Science and Technology and Liberal Government, here to attend the British Columbia Economic Forecast and Constitutional Conference and meeting under the Chamber of Commerce, who are doing their duty in Vancouver. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Jack.
Next, Bulloch, John Bulloch, Canadian Federation of Independent Businessmen. I've nothing bright this morning at all. After the break. John Bulloch came out of his father's clothing store in Toronto, and I've watched him over the past, how many years, John?
10 years.
10 years. Carve himself into a considerable figure of importance in this country, a man who speaks out bluntly in favor of help and encouragement for small business, which he regards as the basis of the free enterprise system, right?
That's pretty good.
As you look at Canada today, John, are you not depressed? Tell me why you're depressed about, forget the Constitution, why are you depressed about the state of business in this country today?
I think I'm depressed because Canada probably has a better decade or a future ahead of it than any country in the Western world, and yet we're squandering it away over regional squabbles and insane arguments over whether energy should be cheap or expensive, and I think that there's more potential for economic development in all the regions of Canada through higher priced energy and more chances for economic growth and security in the future in Canada than there is in the United States, in Japan, in Germany, and most of the countries in the world, and here we are squandering it away because of political difficulties.
Can we follow it up?
Of course we can follow it up. I mean, we only have two options, screw it up or take advantage of opportunity, and right now we're screwing it up.
All right, let's look at the energy policy of this country. Are we living in a fool's paradise where we pay on a subsidized basis so little for gas and so comparatively little for fuel? Is this a fool's paradise?
Yes, and it's the product of minority government politics. What's happening, events are moving too fast for our political system. We've had minority government in Ottawa, and the Liberals said, hey, we found a good way to throw Clark out. And then we've got minority government in Ontario. And if Davis didn't support cheap energy, he'd be thrown out. So we're the victim of political circumstances. I don't believe any responsible politician really believes that cheap energy is in our interest, because Canada is uniquely endowed with lots of energy, but a shortage of conventional oil. So we need the higher prices to make economic developments on the East Coast and Quebec. Quebec's going to face a major boom period ahead as a result of hydro. The Eastern Arctic is going to revitalize the whole East Coast, offshore drilling, conventional oil in the West as well as synthetics. We've got a massive future ahead of us.
I know the problem that's facing it, but it's a real political problem. The people of British Columbia at the moment have a subsidy of about $120 million a year or more on their natural gas because the government didn't increase it. And the government here is under incredible pressure because the U.S. will not buy our $5.40 cents Canadian for what natural gas we can export to the state. We've lost much of the market, and if we have a natural gas tax over the budget next week, the Lord knows what's going to happen here.
Well, I don't think you're going to get that kind of a tax. Remember, in politics, they're always kind of sneaky. Anytime a federal politician is slipping his hand into your right pocket, you should always instinctively put your hand on your left pocket, because they're trying to divert your attention. And I don't think they ever intended to de-index the system or to have an export tax, but that certainly stirs the people up so that whatever comes down in McEachin's budget will seem wonderful and fair and not so bad after all. This is a political process. Raising taxes is a very political game.
De-index, you better explain that. That means that at the moment our personal allowances and our income tax are indexed to the CPI. Is that
what it means
so?
is that inflation doesn't push you into a higher bracket. And therefore governments don't get automatic cheap revenues because of inflation. And I think it's a marvelous thing and should never be sacrificed. But I think they were throwing up a trial balloon so that whenever they do come forward with tax increases of various kinds, it'll always seem, well, it's not nearly as bad as what we thought. And of course, that's the political game.
Well, you made two predictions. One, they will not de-index the personal allowances and income tax, and they will not introduce an export tax on natural gas.
I don't think they'll do either.
Do you not think so?
No.
Don't you think they might put a tax on all forms of export energy?
No.
Hydro, gas, oil?
I would expect a refinery tax myself, plus additional tax on the corporate side. I expect that they'll get most of the revenues that way. The proper source for many of those revenues would have been the excise tax on gasoline, because it's consumption tax. You see, we're heading into 10 years of massive investment and development, and the emphasis of the government should be on taxing consumption rather than income and savings.
So the Tories were right?
Tories were essentially right, yes.
Are you a Tory?
No.
What are you?
Nothing.
Why?
I'm nonpartisan. I have no.
You mean nonpartisan free enterpriser?
Oh yes, I have no party affiliations. I just swing with the issues. Mm-hmm. But the point is, you can't tell the people the truth when they're not ready to listen. And they weren't ready to listen to the reality of expensive energy. And it's much more serious. Let me just reinforce this point. This is very life and death kind of business. We're talking at least $55 to $60 international crude prices in Canadian dollars by 1984. We're going to have to bring up oil at the rate of $7 a barrel. Lockheed was quite responsible. $5 is a minimal. You'll have to go up $7 a barrel a year between now and 84 just to be at 75% of world levels. And the reality of that is massive. But it shouldn't be something that scares us. It should be something that we see as an opportunity.
You're telling me that you want to see a realistic price paid by industry, east and west and central, for our oil to within 75% or 85% of the world price. But what the devil will this do to the inflation rate in this country?
Well, the proper way to do it is to do it all at once. But but politically, you can't do that. The proper way to handle anything that is inevitable from an economic point of view is Bang, just like that, massive and immediate. And then you'll have the massive impact on people's behavior in terms of consumption.
Oh, what about jobs, though? There'll be hundreds of thousands thrown out of work.
No, I have studied this in all the countries that have raised it. You have massive dislocation for 12 months, and then you have readjustment a year later. There will be. The point is you'll have more of a shock, more jobs lost if you just ease it. Better to have the shock right away and move into all the other areas of opportunity. There's massive new technologies coming along that are energy cheap, microelectronics, microbiology. There's massive development opportunities in Canada to provide the machinery and the services for $210 billion of energy expenditures in the next 10 years. Energy is a massive Canadian opportunity. We're not like Germany where when the price goes up, we got to say, well, who's going to buy another $100 million worth of cars or television sets or whatever. For Canada, higher price energy means creating massive development in eastern Canada. Forget the West. I'm sick of hearing about the West, the whining and carping and all the rest of it. The real issue in this country is that higher priced energy is going to change the balance of power in Canada. It's going to create a boom situation in Quebec. It's going to create a boom situation in Newfoundland. It's going to turn Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Quebec into half provinces in 10 years. And therefore, the role of the federal government in taking your dough and sending it east is going to be something that's not necessary. The important thing about energy and resource development is that the structural balance of Canada will change. It's not just a question of you getting your dough out here. It's a question of making development, industrial development, and regional development happen.
Say that again. Did you say you're sick and tired of the whining and moaning from the western provinces? The western provinces which have been at the wrong end of the freight rates, which have been discriminated against again and again and again by the power barons and the secondary industry in Ontario and Quebec. Are you telling me that the West has had a fair deal all these years?
No, of course not.
That's what you seem to say to me.
I'm sick and tired of hearing this argument, which is a phony argument, that the oil issue involves a question of not allowing the West to catch up. That's a historical kind of an argument. The real debate on energy should be the national development that's possible. That not only will we build a more diversified Western economy, not only will we have a strong West, but we're going to have a very strong Quebec economy. Quebec will spend $65 billion in the next 10 years on hydro development. You're going to have massive development in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia on natural gas. You're going to have the high Arctic.
Hold on. I've lost the track somewhere along the line. You're telling me this is all going to happen if we bring prices up to world prices tomorrow in oil?
If the quicker we bring them up, the quicker the economics of all these projects will come into play. And they're on the drawing boards now. I'm sitting, Jack, I've been for 2 years on the Major Projects Task Force in this country, analyzing
Whose task force?
It was set up originally by the federal government, but it has no government participation. It's 60 leaders of business and industry looking at $200 to $400 of energy spending in the next 20 years and deciding how do we turn this into an opportunity for all of Canada. It's not because it's very easy to develop your country by bringing in South Koreans, by using American machinery, U.S. construction firms. You don't have to have Canadian involved at all. And what do we end up with? A high dollar, nothing else. And you kill your tourism, kill your pulp and paper industry. If we don't turn high-priced energy into a genuine opportunity to create lasting economic development and growth and industry, we're going to be hurt by higher-priced energy.
Hooray! Don't quite understand them. After the break. Let's, with John Bulloch, Canadian Federation of Independent Businessmen, just go once more lightly on this energy proposition you have. You're a member of something called the Major Task Force on Energy. Is that right?
No, it's the Major Projects Task Force, is a short form, and what they're doing is examining the mega projects that are on the drawing boards over the next 20 years and trying to determine how do we create industrial opportunity and regional benefits for Canadians.
What's the world price of oil at the moment?
The world price is around over $36, $37, I think.
What's the price in Alberta? To the Alberta government?
Well, our price is about 45% of the Saudi price, so it's less than half, essentially, of the Saudi Arabian price.
Right. Now, how much do we subsidize to keep the oil prices down for all the country? I emphasize
I
just
would think the
Alberta.
total subsidies in terms of prices is around $30 billion.
And you're telling me, therefore, that if we realistically, with a pragmatic government, went straight to somewhere close to world price...
But let's take the Alberta proposal of 75% of world prices. We move quickly to that, we would spin off massive regional development and industrial development in Canada, and we wouldn't have to worry about what's happening to Ontario, because Ontario would benefit as much as anybody. For every $7 billion oil sands plant that you build in Alberta, you have to go to Ontario for $1 billion worth of machinery. Ontario does the argument from Ontario of low energy is a political argument. There isn't a business leader in the Ontario that says they want low prices. They want markets.
Davis would say, look, I'm doing this privately. He might tell you, I'm doing this for the sheerest sake of political expediency on the price of gasoline in the province of Ontario.
If he didn't do that, the Liberals would take the ground and he'd be out of power because he has a minority government.
You're saying that this shock to us of going to 75% of world prices would create industrial dislocation in many industries for about a year.
About a year. I've watched it in Europe, I've watched it in Japan. You get a lot of dislocation, but people instantly change their patterns of behavior, and everybody, including industry, go into massive conservation, substitution. The marketplace is a powerful force. You can't replace the marketplace with 50 or 60 bureaucrats.
I must admit, you go to Britain and they've got $3 gasoline and the roads are still jammed, though, despite the inflation, despite the increase.
Well, those aren't the gasoline is not the price-sensitive commodity. The commodity is industrial usage of energy, which is very price-sensitive, and they would massively go into substitution of alternatives and they would go into new technologies. The wave of the future is the technologies that are energy cheap, and these micro technologies and electronics and biology, these are the multi-billion-dollar industries of the future, and as long as you're going to not provide economic incentive, industry is going to get behind the world.
I gather, too, that you're quite a nationalist because you made a remark you don't want to bring in a whole bunch of South Koreans to do cheap labor owned by Americans. You want to create Canadian industry and Canadian ownership.
We want to use this opportunity to redress what is essentially weak in this country. Number one, we don't have enough skilled manpower. The Western development is being held back more by skilled manpower than by constitutional issues. We don't have a diversified industrial base in this country. We don't have enough firms. We need 1,000 more companies that are vital and alive and capable of exporting and import replacing. We don't have development balanced in the country, and energy development will create development in Eastern Canada.
Why, for instance, don't we in the 1980s, after a fairly affluent educational system since the war, why do we not have our own skilled tradesmen? Why do we have to steal them from Britain, Europe, and elsewhere?
Well,
and we even bring the unskilled labor from the Orient?
Cheaper. It was cheaper. And
that was your colleagues' faults.
Well, that was a false economy because we got skilled labor for the 20-year period after the war, and now it's dried up. It's not there anymore. So the point is we're caught with resources in the formal educational side and not enough resources into the on-the-job kind of training. And this has to be a massive switch over the next 20 years to correct the people.
You've certainly changed over the years. When you started out as a spokesman for the little guy who needed money from federal agencies, and you told him how to get it. And
oh, we still do that. That hasn't changed. Listen, Jack, what we're heading into is the equivalent of war. We are going into a massive shift of resources out of the consumer side of the economy into the investment side. Just like in wartime, you put all your resource into armaments and war materials. That's what's happening in Canada. And there'll be a tremendous adjustment for small business who are supplying the consumer side of the economy, small manufacturers, retailers, distributors. And we have to provide the financing to get the entrepreneurs into other parts of the economy. There's massive opportunities
But what about the little guy right now? How does the little guy right now do with competition from big business or high interest rates or difficult financing? How does he manage right now?
Well, what we're doing on the interest rate side, which is the biggest problem for small business, is we're asking the government on an interim basis to extend the small business development bonds, which give them lower cost money for expansion purposes, not for operating purposes, just for expansion purposes. And that's something we'll be looking for in the budget next week. But in the long term, you can't bring interest rates down until we correct the basic problems in the economy. We got a $6 billion deficit internationally, and you can't have independent interest rate policies as long as you've got an economy that's weak. So we have to deal with in the short term, we have short-term remedies, but in the long term, we have to swing the emphasis in Canada from consumption to investment and development in order to cure our deficit internationally and our deficit domestically. And that's tough political medicine.
You haven't made any harangue about over-government in this country. Feather bedding, index pensions, the usual routine things. You don't care about them now.
Oh, jeez, Jack, that's a good line. I think, first of all, on the constitutional issue and too much government, the small business sector is dead quiet. First of all, they don't care too much about the constitutional debate. When they see governments fighting together, they know one of the two of them is trying to get their hands in their pocket. You know, they're suspicious.
Quite simple.
And they know that we've got too much government. We have overlapping. And you can't deal with too much government if you're going to put politicians in front of television and you've got one guy in political trouble, two guys going into an election, another guy with minority government, and expect to get anything but anger and frustration from people with all this kind of posturing that's going on. So that we have too much government, we have an overlap government, but people don't understand where we have too much government. Our problem in Canada is that the federal government takes 70 cents of all of the money it receives and distributes it from Peter to Paul. And it functions
You mean
as
the transfer payments, unemployment insurance, welfare,
cost-sharing
schemes?
programs, equalization program. Every single thing the federal government does is geographic. And 70% of their money is transferred. And really what the federal government is and unfortunately most of the federal cabinet look at themselves as the board of directors of kind of a national children's aid society. And they're looking after the weak provinces and all the other suffering people in Canada, such as Chrysler and Massey Ferguson. They want to help the weak and the downtrodden.
How can Massey Ferguson, is that Conrad Black?
Was.
How can they have the gall to ask for government money?
All you got to do is ask.
Are they going to get it?
Probably.
And Chrysler got it?
Yep.
No guarantees of future employment?
Well, if they go bust, what can you guarantee?
I mean, there are no guarantees of future employment.
Well, there's supposed to be some guarantees, but I don't think there really are, or can they give them?
And this is straight political payola in its most brutal terms.
Well, it's say political forces at work when you've got 3 cabinet ministers in Chrysler's area. But it's a bad misdirection of priorities. In the countries, we should be looking at the growth areas of the future, not the areas of like the auto industry or Massey Ferguson.
You remind me of the old Churchill. You'd like to see 12 persons for 10 jobs, so that there was always
How do you mean?
That was Churchill's philosophy. Free enterprise economy works when there are 12 people looking for 10 jobs. Those days have gone.
No.
Everybody must now get a job or government support.
Well, that doesn't solve our problem. We've got massive economic problems now. We have a $15 billion deficit. We have a $6 billion deficit internationally. Why? Because for 10 years, all we did was transfer money around. You don't create a lasting base giving people money.
Okay, I like your line. The federal government in Canada today, particularly the Liberal government, operates as a national children's aid society.
A national welfare agency in which they feel they've got to take money from somebody and give it to somebody else. And that's the problem in Canada. That's what's complicating the Western debate. Because people say, hey, what happens if you give them more money from the Western money? What are they going to do with it? Are they going to fund social programs that are biased towards the high population centers? Or are they going to go into development? They have a role, national role in development that they need to play.
You haven't attacked unions once.
Well, you haven't asked me a union question.
Okay, attack them.
I'm against strikes in the public sector.
You'd ban them tomorrow.
I would have no trouble banning them tomorrow.
You'd give them arbitration instead.
Not necessarily.
Because arbitration means half of the demand is against half of the unwillingness, doesn't it?
I don't think that you can, there's a number of things you'd have to do, but I don't think that you can have powerful militant groups like the post office capable of setting trends in the public sector that become the standard. Impossible.
John Bulloch, CFIB.
Impossible.
No government in your lifetime will turn back the clock on unions and ban strikes in the public sector.
Well, there's different ways of doing it. You can ban them, or you could make it, you could give the private citizens and businesses the right to sue unions that act illegally. You know, there's many other ways. You could ban the strikes in only 2 or 3 areas, like the post office, such as the air traffic controllers, such as firemen. Those are the ones. I mean, why doesn't the tax department go on strike and stay out for 10 years? Why doesn't Statistics Canada go on strike?
It was out on strike.
Well,
the tax department.
Why don't they stay out for 5 or 6 years? Why do we want to settle with the tax department? Why do we want to settle with Statistics Canada? Why do we want to settle with all the bureaucratic agencies that harass the small businessman? We don't mind them going on strike and staying out forever.
Fire them.
No, let them go on strike and stay out, and we'd make a tremendous saving for the taxpayers. But the trouble is, the only ones that really go out on strike and create all the problem are the ones that can hurt the innocent people.
How about some phone calls, John? I'm exhausted. Phone calls to Bulloch. If you're a businessman especially, or whatever, who cares? Help yourself. After the break, to John Bulloch. John Bulloch, Federation of Independent Businessmen.
Business, not businessman.
Business.
Canadian Federation of Independent Business.
Despises Liberals and the Tories for their inefficiency and their lack of foresight. Despise too strong?
No, I just say that political events are going too fast for the political system.
Well, it won't be long till we have a national NDP government anyway, will it?
I wouldn't know. They're all the same.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Jack, I've never heard such a crock in all my life. Does your guest realize how many millions of dollars a day that the oil companies are ripping us off that's going across the border? This is one aspect of it. The other one, with the MPs, 2 terms of office, they get a pension. You've got 1,100 translators. If these guys can't speak French, the MPs, they shouldn't run. You've got the Senate, which is an overpay. Everybody's got 2 jobs. And they wonder why we're running at a deficit. I think the whole country, I mean, take, for example, the guy who picks up the tab, the working man. These businessmen, they don't care if gas is $10 a gallon. They can write it off, but not the working man. He has to pay it. Like everything else, he pays the shot. He's talking about building up Ontario, building up Quebec. What about us in the West? This man is definitely a spokesman for Western separatism.
John Bulloch.
Well, I thought your questioner is a crock. First of all, the question of whether oil companies are transferring money out of Canada, that can be handled very easily. I mean, you can.
But it happens.
Well, that's if it's happening, it's our own stupidity.
But it is happening.
To a degree, but that's
Exxon owns a lot.
But there's I would say more than 100% right now of their earnings are being reinvested in Canada. But the potential for massive transfer out, I believe in the long term, you have to own a substantial portion of your energy industry because the resource will be going into that industry. And it's like a person that puts a lot of money into his house and doesn't own his house. Canada will have to get a much greater control over the energy side of the economy, or else they have a tax system where taxes go into super taxes if the money is distributed, not reinvested. That can be handled in the
Now,
tax
you
system.
agree with the guy on the MPs, layabouts.
Well, I agree completely with the gentleman that there's a tremendous waste in the federal system in terms of index pensions and tremendous waste in terms of the cost of the federal bureaucracy.
See, what
No
stuck
question
in
about
his
that.
craw and what stuck in my craw too was that your whole image is centered on increasing the industry in Quebec, big booms in Quebec, big booms in...
No. That's the most important thing for you out here, because what has been the debate in Western Canada? They take your money, the federal government takes your money, and they distribute it to Ontario and Quebec. What I'm saying is that role that the federal government has played in the past is not going to be the role it'll play in the future, because you're going to have provinces in the future. Quebec, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia will have provinces probably by 1990, and the massive transfer resources that have been the history of Canada will not be the history of the future.
It's convoluted, but I get the point. Get the point.
Point, Jack. There was 450 machinists were brought over from England. Now we have
Hold on, please.
that are educated in this country that if these businesses could have foreseen, and they could have trained young Canadians to take these jobs.
I agree with that.
And another aspect is that he's talking about energy. Why the heck don't we go into using natural gas or octanes for running?
Anyway, he annoyed me and he annoyed you too, perhaps because we didn't understand him. But thanks for your call. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'd like Mr. Bulloch's view on if the public sector can't strike and he doesn't like the views of arbitration, how are these people supposed to get contracts settled?
Well, you will have some form of arbitration, but it'll have to be within guidelines laid down by government, such as comparability. The simple fact is, without trying to appear hard on any group, because I had a lot of sympathy for the clerks that went 2 years without a contract, let me emphasize that you cannot run any nation if the public sector in the settlements leads the private sector. That should be a fundamental rule on which you operate.
Are they not now pampered babies, the federal civil servants?
Well, I would say it's not that they're pampered babies. We have sectors that have too much power. 9 firemen can shut the nation down. Clerks in 3 postal buildings can shut the National Post Office down. That's insanity. That's anarchy.
True enough. 40% of all the mail goes through that big new dreadful place in Toronto. Is that not correct?
That's right. And only a small handful of clerks can shut the National Postal Office down. And we have yet to go into postal negotiations. The postal negotiations are now coming, and you can be assured that the Canadians will suffer with the loss of post office service around Christmas.
The Auditor General produced a study that they only get 60% working efficiency from some federal civil servants.
I would always consider that probably on the high side.
What would you say, 20%?
That'd be more like it.
Go ahead from Victoria.
Hello. I'd like to, first of all, compliment John Bulloch, and I'm 100% in agreement with everything he said there. And I say this from the point of view from my own experience, which was one time was an entrepreneur and as a skilled tradesman and also working for the Federal Civil Service. I'd say that the Federal Civil Service is around about 10% efficient. And the other thing I'd like to do is just put this forth as a word to describe what way the federal government is going. And the way I would call it would be it's going towards bureaucratic feudalism. And that's about all I got.
Bureaucratic feudalism.
That's right.
Not bad, is it? I feel that way on a bad day myself. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack. About the public service not being permitted to strike. Now, they're always behind the private sector in their wages. And I worked for 7 years as a public servant in the post office. And when I started out, I was having an NHA home built for me. And I used to come home after delivering my rounds of mail and see about 6 carpenters and plumbers working in this house. And I had to figure out, oh, God, they're getting $3 an hour. And I'm only making $150 or $175 a month. How in the hell am I paying for this? And, of course, I had a mortgage, which was taking me 25 years to pay off. Now, as far as them striking, I think they should be able to go and strike. And as far as the post office, I think the Mounties should run. They got their fingers in it all the time anyway.
Thank you, sir. Times have changed since it was $3 an hour, haven't they? What's the rate now? About 12 or 13, 14 for a carpenter?
Could be.
Something like that. Go ahead, please.
Hello, yeah, Mr. Webster. To your guest, I'd like to talk about strikes in the civil service. I'd like to point out that postal workers 10 years ago, when Cup W was first formed, were making almost as much as firemen or policemen. If you want to talk about strikes in the civil service and about how unbalanced the bargaining position has become, I'd have to tend to agree with you. We're now making substantially less than these people that we used to be compared with 10 years ago. And now we're supposedly a strong militant trade union movement.
Well, the point, you see, John, that you've got to get through your thick free enterprise head, that every working man in the country wants the same wages as everyone else, and the same working conditions, and the same 35-hour week, and the same index pensions. The old business of merit, or what the job is worth, is down the tube. You'll agree that, don't you?
I'm only saying that as a matter of policy, you cannot govern any nation if the public sector leads the nation in settlements. I'm not saying they shouldn't have comparability, but you can't create power blocks within the public sector that can set patterns of wages and hours and fringe benefits that cannot be supported by the private sector.
Has that happened?
That has happened over the last 2 decades, yes.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, this fellow, the first speaker actually said most of the things that I wanted to say, but I'll tell you this much, that I'd sure hate to work for this man. He'd keep me downtrodden back in the days of F-30, where he feels that his dollar, that his investment is worth 5 of mine, etc. As far as the multinational oil companies investing more than 100% of their profits in Canada, that's a bunch of crap also, because the report just came in. They've been reducing their investment from their profits in Canada. Yeah, I don't know. I just don't understand this fellow at all. I think that, like I said before, what he would like to see is the public sector way behind the private enterprise, so he could sit on top of his little old world and look down on the public sector worker and say, "Pooh on you, man. I'm here. You stay down there, Buster."
That's a lot of crap.
Thank you. Mind your language, please. You and the callers.
Well, if your caller's going to ask such dumb questions, I'm going to give them dumb responses. How can they possibly say I'm trying to look down the public sector? The only business where I've been involved actively, our family business, we've had higher than union wages for something like 35 years. And we set the pattern in the industry for wages and benefits. Our own salaries are way above union level. This is not the point at all. The basic point is you cannot govern a nation if the public sector leads the private sector, and you cannot give excessive power. And this has got nothing to do with philosophy. These are the ways in which Germany, a social democratic country, runs its affairs. The policy in Germany is that no settlements in the public sector shall lead the private sector.
John,
if you do, you hurt your economy.
I must come to your support in that. I think the federal civil servants and the softness of the federal Liberal government have created potentially a state of anarchy in this country if it continues to go down the hill the same way. I wouldn't use John's foul language, but I would agree with some of his attitude. After the break. John Bulloch, Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Not businessmen, business, right? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Mr. Bulloch.
I've listened to you Bay Street high rollers long enough. It's about time you realize that the Canadian cowboy out here can outdo you people 3 times to 1 in business. And if we decide to close off Western Canada, where are you going to be? You're not going to have your fancy cars and your big buildings. You're going to be down working with us. And as far as your freight rates are concerned, I've been a trucker for years. And we're still fighting this crow's nest freight rate way back in 1898. Now, why don't you do something about that and quit your crying about the Western Canadians? We're sick and tired of listening to the Easterners run us.
How do you like that, John?
Well, it's another question that is kind of stupid.
Stupid be damned.
Because I didn't say, first of all, I'm not a Bay Street roller. I don't work on Bay Street. I'm not a financial person. My background is small business and education, so I'm not a Bay Street roller, so that was silly. Secondly, I did not take any shots at the West. We're supporting, against the political pressure of central Canada, high oil prices, which will move tens of billions of dollars of national resources into Western Canada. We're saying that the federal government has to use its share of energy for development purposes, and the important part of that development is in the transportation area in Western Canada to diversify the economy of Western Canada. We're saying that higher oil prices will trigger massive energy-based and resource-based and transportation-based development in Eastern Canada, so that you won't have to be sending money to Ottawa to fund social health and welfare programs in Eastern Canada, that you'll have a healthier kind of economy, that there's no anti-Western feeling. We are solidly supporting nationally Lougheed's position on energy pricing as being realistic and responsible.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I just have 2 points I'd like to make, then I'd like to hang up and have John make his comment on it. First of all, we have a precedent or an example in history which is not too far away that we can all remember. About this time, or in the German economy, there began to become massive trade union grabbing, if you like, and massive profit taking. The economy got so bad that they couldn't even take their wages home in a wheelbarrow, and a wheelbarrow full of money wouldn't buy a loaf of bread. Now, we're going to get to that very, very quickly, far quicker than most people realize. This is because we have no controls and no strength in our government. Secondly, your government worker. Your government worker has negotiated himself into a position through the trade unions where he cannot be fired, literally. He has to do something extremely gross to get any sort of discipline or anything else. And the management of the government people is afraid to touch them. You see, when the unions come out and say everybody will get $11, $12, or $13 an hour, whatever it happens to be, even the poorest worker will get that money. Therefore, your quality of individual across the board, why should a better worker with a bit of incentive work any harder than the poorest worker? And consequently, this business of equalization of payments waters everything down. Mr. Bulloch, I'd like to ask you a question. What is your question? What is your possible solution to a situation like that?
Okay, hang up and listen.
Well, first of all, I don't believe you're going to have Canada printing money the way Germany did after the last war. I think the situation is quite different. Our problem in Canada is that we don't have an independent monetary policy. We're so locked into the American economy. Our Bank of Canada functions like a 51st state, and we don't have an independent monetary policy. So if the Americans expand and inflate their economy, we'll be forced to do the same thing. Our monetary policy is being determined by Washington. Secondly, I tend to agree that there's perhaps too much power in the public service side of the trade union movement. I happen to know personally most of the union leaders in this country. I've served on government advisory committees over 10 years to get to know most of them personally. Generally speaking, I think you have a very high quality labor leader in Canada. I know most of them personally, and there's only a few that I feel perhaps have excess power, and that's because we've given them that power in the public service, and they tend to dominate the trade unions. I think our problems in Canada will not be solved by union bashing, will not be solved by anti-this or anti-that. We have to increase our productivity and pull ourselves together to take advantage of 20 years of outstanding development opportunities in the resource transportation area.
John, you're weaseling a little bit on
issue.
that. He put it to you about the handicap in trying to fire government servants. Do you agree with that at all? Do you agree that we're building in a kind of low-caliber servant who is totally secure, can't be touched, and can sit back in his laps and help himself?
Governments can do anything if they want to do it.
What about the wheelbarrows? Why shouldn't? Look at the price of houses in Vancouver today. Look at the $200,000 for a lot.
That is not related.
What do you mean it's not related?
It's not related to federal monetary policy. In Germany,
But
they
we're
were
talking about inflation.
Well, inflation, that's a supply and demand situation that's unique to this area. We have, I have a staff, a person I'm hiring in outside Quebec City. His home is worth $50,000. The same house in Toronto is $90. The same house in Calgary is $125, and the same house is $160 in BC. You can't call it national monetary policy. You have supply and demand situations created by excessive growth in the western
But we're
part of the
certainly
country.
shaking the economy when all kinds of people are committing themselves to all kinds of houses, which they can only possibly meet part of the interest payments if all three of them in the family are working.
Well, of course, and that's a special supply and demand problem in the high growth parts of the country, especially in Western Canada. It's not a national problem that will be solved by national
wheelbarrows.
policy.
You don't think we'll come
Not
to
a bit,
wheelbarrows?
not a bit.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Yes, I wanted to adjust myself to the energy situation that he was talking about. I want to agree completely with him. I think that we should increase the price of oil because, like, we're paying $16 to Alberta, and Canadian companies are drilling in the States and getting $40 U.S. for oil. Now, the money that they're sending down there should be spent up here.
That's a
and
good
I think
point.
that we should raise the prices as quickly as possible because the Germans did and the Japanese did, and their economy is thriving. And as long as you hold it off, you have to keep increasing steadily. And like he says, it's going to have to be about $7 a barrel a year. And I think that we should get some government guys in there that think about the people more than they think about themselves. Like, go in there and once they get elected, say, okay, listen, this is the way it's got to be. We've got to do it this way. If you don't want to re-elect me next time, I can't help that. But we've got to do it this way because that's it.
Okie dokie, thank you very much. Go to the next
I
call.
agree completely with
Prince
what he has to
George, you still there?
Yes, I am. I wanted to talk to Mr. Bulloch about not enough skilled tradesmen. My husband's an apprentice, and how are you supposed to be able to buy tools and be on apprenticeship wages? Why doesn't the government subsidize you for your tools or even let you claim your tools on your income tax? Because by the time my husband, he's as an apprentice mechanic, by the time he's finished his apprenticeship, he should have about $5,000 worth of tools. Now, he can't claim it on his income tax.
Problem? Is she right or wrong?
Well, I think she's partially right. There was a program to subsidize purchase of tools when there was conversion into metric, but I am not informed enough technically to say that the lack of financing for apprenticeship purchasing of tools is the factor in the shortage of apprentices. I think the major problem is industry, which a former caller alluded to. Industry for 20 years has taken the easy road of bringing people in.
And also unions make it very difficult in provincial programs for people to come into the apprenticeship field.
In some areas, don't label unions as a major problem. In some areas, unions,
no doubt about it.
Unions have
Time for the break.
restricted apprenticeship.
John Bulloch, you're getting angrier and angrier as you get older and older, and you're looking forward to a disastrous budget on Tuesday.
No, I'm looking forward to the federal government offering Canadians some light at the end of the tunnel by saying we're going to give you a tough budget, but this tough budget is going to set the pattern for 20 years of economic development and prosperity.
My thanks to John Bulloch, President of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. I'll be back after the news. That was quite good fun this morning. I'm beginning to fall behind in some of my mail, which I'd like to tell you about, because quite a bit of the mail is making reference to the midnight rebroadcasts of the Webster show, which are apparently going down very well indeed. But you realize, of course, that you cannot call on the midnight show. And even though they will say so, people, automatically think if Webster's there, they can make calls. One of the letters we got from the Webster show, the midnight repeat, referred to Bukowski, who was a defector who writes occasionally in the province. And this writer from Clearbrook said, "It's nice that you repeated Bukowski's comments. I," says the writer, "grew up under Stalin in that great paradise where I lost all my loved ones and everything I treasured. My parents died there. At least I think so. We never heard from my father after he was sent away to the Gulag in 1937. Personally, I came out as a teenager. Listen to this. Having walked over 5,000 miles with hundreds of thousands of people through ice and snow, crossing rivers, mountains, and forests. Some of my relatives, like my sister, who spent 10 years as a child in Siberia in coal and iron mines, survive. I still experience nightmares after all these years." Here's another letter which asks about our 7-second delays. I would like to see you do a short segment to explain to your audience exactly what is happening and when and why they get TV schizophrenia. I'm sure most people do not understand what is occurring in the studio when they can talk to you live and see your TV reply 7 seconds after they've had it on the telephone. That's from Lillooet. Now let me explain that. The program, before it goes out on the air, goes through a delay tape. This is so I can kill an obscenity or a libelous or slanderous remark if I so wish. If you want a call on the program, you must put the television sound down. Otherwise, you get the delayed sound in one ear as you're trying to speak, and that causes instant mental confusion, even to an old pro like me. Next letter. This is about abortion. How slow you were in your interview with Dr. Franson of Surrey Memorial Hospital. He said the decision to abolish the abortion committee was not a community decision. This woman says the community elected the board over a period of 3 years to decide the affairs of the hospital. Why didn't you point this out? You apparently, she says of Webster, agreed with Dr. Franson that 600 abortions a year had to be performed for reasons of health, yet you mentioned the woman with 9 children as a particular case of desperation. I failed to see the connection. Have you ever investigated the reasons given for an abortion? Social, economic, convenience, contraceptive failure is about as serious as it ever goes. A few nights ago, you were very heated and concerned about the government wasting public money to bring back a waitress from Newfoundland to Cache Creek. Why are you not also concerned about the waste of public health care money to kill the unborn so needlessly and in such staggeringly large numbers, all to fill the pockets of greedy doctors? Just take that away for a minute and let me say something. Am I up to the end of my segment? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Let me say something. My objection to the takeover of abortion committees by people who can change the directorate of the local hospital is that it is a direct contradiction and contravention of the intent of the criminal code as approved by men whom we regard as competent enough to do anything else to us physically or surgically in the terms of medical treatment. It was not the intent of the federal government, elected by the majority of the people of this country, both conservative and liberal, to allow a local group to completely abort the intent of a law of the land. If these people want to stop all abortions, wham, slam, finito, benito, the rest of it, what they must do before they will get the authority they require is to get the federal government to change the criminal code in Ottawa. That is the point I make now and will continue to make again. One last letter I'll use this morning from Vernon. Where is it? A brief comment concerning your observation that more than one lawyer is running in the Vancouver Mayoralty. A rancher friend from the Chilcotin community of Big Creek once remarked, having a lawyer in an elected political position is akin to leaving a weasel in charge of the chicken. Now, I didn't say that. Okie dokie, no more letters this morning. But I'll show some more letters. Try and keep them short. Occasionally I edit them, and I try to edit them reasonably accurately. And I'll be back to close the show right after these messages. Let's stay away from the Constitution tomorrow if we can, please, Gladys. Good idea?
That would be an excellent idea.
Mind you, it's got to be tackled. We've got to do it. But I thought that Bulloch this morning was in rare form, wasn't he?
Oh, he has become quite magnificent.
Tomorrow we may be dealing with these 2 prison officers who are in trouble for talking out of turn too much. And we have a couple of other stories we're going to be dealing with too in the morning. And we'll have some stuff from Steve. 9 a.m. precisely.